It's just days and nights. So, thank you for coming. These Parlor Talks go from wonderful, happy memories to tough subjects by design. Because you can't, and there's Sarah. And Sarah needs to sit right here. Yeah, just leave the boxes, or come in a minute. And that's by design. Because in particular down east, but all of coastal North Carolina is not just a perfect vacation land anymore. It used to be a wonderful fishing community a generation or two ago, but now is a place with a lot of complicated issues, economic, education-wise, certainly cultural, but probably more than any of those is the environmental issues that we're facing. It's tough, and I'll take responsibility for whatever fallout there is for this conversation, because this work, this network of researchers and science agencies has been evolving over the past 2 years, focusing on the visible that we see with sea level rise, and that's the ghost forest. If you've been to sea level and Cedar Island lately, you see these great stands of dead trees, and there's a reason for that. So I started asking around, and the general comment was that Florence did it, or it was pine beetles. And that's not necessarily the case from what I'm learning. So in the process of that awareness and questioning, I got tangled up with a couple of people, including Elizabeth Frakenburg, who was doing research down east about the dynamic impacts of extreme weather. And we do have extreme weather on a regular basis. And in particular Florence, and then Dorian got added in. So that network has grown, includes Sarah Spiegler, who just came in, and many others who are looking at the community down east, in particular, the coast in general, and just considering where we are, where we're going, what our options are, what we need to be prepared for, and their desire and their need to talk to community members on these subjects. Because the science that they study, and many, many others I'm learning are studying, is what we live with every day. So that's what today is about. It's information, it's information, it's knowledge, it's experience, and it's a conversation for you to ask questions. So thank you for being here. We're thinking about taking out walls up here because our Parlor Talks keep growing. And so just if you get hot, let us know. We've got water. Here comes Frank Tursi. Right here is your seat, Mr. Tursi. So, hail, hail, the gang's all here now. But anyway, I'll let Elizabeth start, and we'll see where the conversation goes. There's no agenda, there's no plan. We're just going to let people talk and ask and see what they have to do in response to what they have to say. So you're first, right, Elizabeth?
All right. Sarah, there's a spot for you in here.
Sarah,
Yeah.
you're right here beside Tursi. You're right here, so. And I'll stay right here. How's that?
Perfect.
In a minute. You can stand up and turn.
Hi. Well, thanks, Karen. It's great to be here. As Karen said, so my name is Elizabeth Frakenburg, and I'm a professor of sociology at UNC, and have spent a long time studying actually Indonesia and the impact of the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami on a set of communities that were badly impacted by the waves in comparison to communities in other parts of the island that were not. And so I've been really interested in the long-term effects of flooding and how that affects people's health, but they're also their economic livelihoods, their ideas about migration. And I've been really wanting to take some of the methods we've used for the project in Indonesia and apply them along the coasts of the U.S., where we see, very different physical forces from tsunamis, but nevertheless rise in exposure to extreme events, hurricanes Dorian and Florence in particular, but also increases in recurrent flooding. And it has seemed to me that to do that work well, you need many more areas of expertise than sociology. Sociology really isn't the first thing that comes to mind. But so one of the things we've been trying to do is build a project and an approach that adds in an engineering perspective and also policy and planning, so that we can think about measuring what people, what land and the people who live on them are exposed to in terms of depth of water, how frequently it appears, how long it stays, how fast it moves across the land. And then also think about the strategies that FEMA and other organizations use to try to figure out how to reduce risks, how to get people to take actions that might reduce risks, particularly if these kinds of things are going to intensify. So for, I guess, about 3 years now, we've been working on a project that is in Craven, Carteret, Dare, and Hyde counties. We started by, the piece that I know how to do is talk to people and interview households. And so we drew a random sample of addresses and hired local interviewers, and we've conducted, at this point, probably 600 or so interviews throughout these 4 counties based on this random selection of households. And so if any of you guys were our respondents, thank you very much. I mean, we could not do this without people's contributions of time. So that's kind of the social part, is these questions that ask about when you moved here, why you moved here, whether you were here during Florence and Dorian, what you experienced, how you went about putting your life back together if you had damage, levels of stress, levels of concerns, and then how you're thinking about the future. So that's kind of the social part. And then we've involved a number of other scientists. Rick here is going to talk about the work he does, which we've been trying to, we work together a lot on incorporating his work into the sort of the social side of what people experience. And then there's also another team that's led by Miyuki Hino and Catherine Anarde, who are professors at UNC and State, and they're really worried about measuring recurrent flooding. So the stuff that happens when, the right combination of king tides and high tides and wind push water onto land that wouldn't ordinarily happen. And so they are developing this flood sensor network that they've installed, several sensors in Beaufort and down east, trying to get one out to Ocracoke, and those are measuring recurrent flooding. And they've already found in the initial rollout of this that this recurrent flooding is happening a lot more frequently than people have modeled it to occur. And so it's sort of happening more frequently. It doesn't necessarily ruin your home, but you've got to incorporate it into your thinking and your decision making and when you do your errands and things like that. And so there's kind of 3 prongs to the overall project. I mean, one is the social science survey, another is measuring this recurrent flooding, and the other thing is trying to work on incorporating Rick's models of depth and flow and velocity of water during particularly extreme water events, but also other types of events. So let me turn it over to Rick, and he can.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be here and to chat with you all. I'll start out by saying that deep down and inside I'm an engineer, and so I'm not nearly as well spoken as Elizabeth. I've been a resident in the community for 37 years. I work at UNC's Institute of Marine Sciences, so if you hadn't noticed it, people have historically known about the Institute because we used to have turtles out back in the ponds, so many people knew about those, and then it turned out that they really weren't being treated very humanely, and so we found better homes for them. And then nobody knew about us at all, but now we have this big mural on our building. And so I hope you all have seen that and appreciated that. Pull into the parking lot, look at it. In the 37 years I've been there, may be one of the most fun and just enjoyable things that I have participated in, and it was amazing. Over 60 people painted on that mural, and we had folks just walk by on the street and stop in And so it was wonderful, but it just is an attempt to at least capture a little bit about what we do there at the Institute, and remind you that your neighbors, your community members are actually working in the field, and it's a resource for you. My personal work, again, as a water engineer, if you will, a lot of it has been to develop computer models that predict how water moves, and they've turned out to be fairly useful at predicting flooding and storm surge and things associated with various storms. If you go to New Orleans and you don't get wet when you're there, after Katrina, all of the protection system around New Orleans that was designed and since built with taxpayer money was designed using the computer programs that we've developed here. A lot of work post-Sandy about how to try to make things better in the greater New York, New Jersey area, also done with that. Houston, Galveston, a lot of major areas that have major engineering projects in design, planning, or construction utilize that. Your National Weather Service utilizes it for predictions. And we do a lot of work here for predictions as well. So when there's a hurricane that's coming, we will do predictive runs for flooding, and there's some websites that you can go to see some of the results. And hopefully they're helpful, although we always tell people to listen to the National Weather Service and those groups to make your decisions. But nevertheless, hopefully it adds a little bit. I've had a great pleasure of working with Elizabeth. One of the interesting things, I said I've been here for, 37 years now. You kind of come to Carteret County and it grows quickly on you. And you really, it's, I guess the soil is loose or something. You grow roots quickly, and again, it's a hard place to leave. Interestingly enough, Elizabeth's father hired me to come here. And so she's been off in various places on the West Coast and at that dark blue university here in the state, and is now at Carolina, and then has migrated back to Eastern North Carolina. So again, I think it gets in your blood, and again, hopefully it enriches the community, and thus it's a great privilege to be able to come and chat with you all about things that may be helpful. I would like to ask one question before we go further, and I'm curious where the group is from. So how many folks are from, say, down east, east of Beaufort and further east?
Beaufort and further east?
Yeah, okay. That side of the Newport River, I guess. How about Bogue Banks? How many folks are from Bogue Banks? Okay. And so Newport? More. So how about Morehead City and west of there? All right. So there's a bunch of you all that don't live anywhere, at least that, that I haven't mentioned. Where Emerald Isle down at that end? That's Bogue Banks still, but all right. Well, I guess the point is you're pretty well geographically distributed throughout the area, and so that's good to know as maybe we address questions. So,
Okay. Sarah, would you like to explain yourself? I'm saving Tursi for last. He's going to bat clean up.
Why don't I just stand right here? Does that work? Do I need this mic? Can you guys hear me without the microphone?
She would like it
Recording.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, okay. So, hey everyone. My name is Sarah Spiegler. I work for North Carolina Sea Grant, and I'm the Coastal Resilience Specialist, and I'm 2 doors down from the IMS lab. So my office is at the NC State Center for Marine Sciences and Technology, which is about 5 minutes that way, right next door to the community college. And I brought these magazines, and I have some to hand out to y'all too as well. So I've worked for Sea Grant officially for about 5 years now, and about 3 years ago I got this new position as the Coastal Resilience Specialist. And in my new position, I decided to write a story about coastal resilience in North Carolina, and this is the right here. So this story was really about how are we facing the challenges here in coastal North Carolina related to climate change and sea level rise. And it was just sort of an overview of where we were at the time in 2020. I guess that was after COVID. So I think you're trying to say Hurricane Florence, yes, is a huge landmark hurricane in our state, and that was in the fall of 2018. That was about 3 weeks after I started my job officially with Sea Grant. So I went to my amazing, beautiful office on the Bogue Banks. I have a view of the water, and then 3 weeks later, the hurricane hit, and then CMAS was closed for, a month? You guys were closed for at least a month. It was a very interesting start to my job, and then I'll even backtrack. I moved to Beaufort in 2011, 3 days after Hurricane Irene. 2 days after Hurricane Irene. I was supposed to move here 2 days before. I'm from Ohio, and I had never been through a big hurricane before. So I didn't live through that one. I watched that one on the news and then moved down here. I did live through Hurricane Florence, sorry. I did live through Hurricane Florence, and I actually lived through it in New Bern, North Carolina, which, as many of you know, was the epicenter. We went there thinking we were going to get out of the storm. My partner, Jacob, his family lives in New Bern, so we were there to, help his grandmother and his mother. And my family, who lives around the country, said, "You're where? You're in New Bern, North Carolina. Are you crazy?" I said, "I don't know." So I had the experience a couple days after Florence walking out, and in Jacob's parents' neighborhood, right down the street, all the cars were underwater. We were lucky his parents' house was at the top of the hill. Everywhere else in his neighborhood was flooded. We walked downtown, I had never seen anything like that in my life. We still have communities, we still have houses that are recovering from Florence today, tarps on houses. And of course, the museum was destroyed by Florence, of course. So that was, I had never lived through anything like that before. So I did write about that in this story too, but I brought my newest story that just came out today, actually. And this story is sort of the Resilience 2.0 that's happening here in North Carolina. So this is actually a photo from the north end of Ocracoke, where the ferries to Hatteras used to dock, and now they can't. They've had to move around the corner. And so I brought a bunch of these copies to y'all can have it. This is a story about what is the state doing now, 5 years post-Florence. How are we helping communities, and especially underserved communities in coastal North Carolina, prepare for climate change. And there's also a section about Portsmouth. Sorry, I'm kind of rambling. There's a section about Portsmouth Island, which I know is near and dear to Karen's heart, and that is part of Cape Lookout National Seashore. Nobody lives there anymore, but it used to be a bustling sea town back in the 1800s. And now the Park Service runs the island. There's historic buildings there, and they have a homecoming every 2 years where people like Karen go back and they celebrate their heritage, and they bring lots of great food. So there's this amazing buffet lunch afterwards. So I wrote about this story and about how we are starting to adapt in North Carolina and what we are doing about climate change, because what we know now, and I'm going to say this here, is that climate change is happening and it's impacting our communities right now. And that's now, like the National Science Assessment, the National Climate Assessment, that's what they're saying, that climate change is happening right now, it's impacting us right now. And we can tell, we have these king tides, and they are happening more frequently, and our streets are, I can tell, their streets are flooding more frequently. So we're trying to figure out how do we, in a systematic way, increase the resilience of our communities and our ecosystems here in North Carolina. And we have lots of money coming into the state, and we've done a lot of great things, but we still have lots of challenges. A lot of it is, how do we help underserved communities, like where Karen lives. She lives in an unincorporated town down east, and that brings a whole host of challenges. How do we get money? How do we help people in these areas that are at the forefront of climate change, and they're on the front lines of this, really? So that's what I do in my job. I love my job. I love Beaufort. I love down east. I love the coast here. I was really fortunate to also work on a sailboat here for almost 10 years. So, you know, the beauty of this place is not lost on me, and every day I feel really lucky to live here. And I just had a baby in January, and he's downstairs actually. So Karen, you might get to meet him. And you know, I think about, like, as a kid, I love the water, and I grew up in Ohio. We have water there, but it's not like this. I grew up on Lake Erie, which is a special place too. But I mean, this would have been like my paradise growing up as a kid, and now I get to raise my son here. But I want it to be a place that, you know, in the future our kids are going to enjoy, and, you know, be able to thrive here just as much as, you know, it is definitely a challenge looking forward. We have all sorts of challenges here: development, climate change, flooding, and more people keep moving here every day. So it's a great place to live, but we have to work hard to, you know, have it how we want in the future. Okay, I'm done rambling. You're next.
Okay. Rick, you don't have to be the caddy. I'll just put it in my pocket.
It was getting heavy.
As Karen alluded, I'm Frank Tursi, and I think I'm only here because I'm her friend and she told me to be here. I'm not a scientist. I have been a journalist in North Carolina for 30 plus years, writing on coastal issues. I've traveled this coast from Currituck Banks to Sunset Beach numerous times. I've watched NC-12 deteriorate to now you can't cross it at Hatteras Inlet on a high tide. I've covered every hurricane in this state that's hit this state of South Carolina, starting with Camille. I think it was 79. Yeah, I'm an old guy. Until I retired in 2015, dozens of hurricanes. I've watched storms get worse. You know, I've been writing about this issue back when it was called global warming, and it was really science fiction. And I always thank my editors for just letting me follow my nose, because really back then, back in the 80s and the 70s, the science was rudimentary at best. We were really guessing. The computer models were not very good. But it was obvious things were happening. And I have interviewed hundreds. Town officials, scientists, residents, and anyone who lives on the water and has lived there for any length of time knows something is happening. Flooding is getting worse. In my second life, I am the mayor pro tem in the town of Swansboro, and I got a bone to pick with you that Swansboro wasn't in your article. But we were really one of the first coastal communities. There were a handful 5 years ago, and Swansboro was among that handful. We redid our land use plan with a climate change component, where at least we've identified the issues that would, the infrastructure. We have roads, our two major roads. Anyone here been to Swansboro? Yeah. Okay, Front Street will be on the water. Water Street will be on the water. And probably in the next 10 years. And so we have taken steps with our land use plan, our watershed management plan. We were one of the first towns to get a grant from Division of Coastal Management on resiliency. And we can talk about that, but that's a phrase that's used a lot now. And if you depend on grants, whether you're a nonprofit or a little town with a $4 million budget like Swansboro, we couldn't possibly meet the challenge with our budget. So we rely on grants. And resiliency grants is where the money is at the moment. So, and I have urged our town officials to take advantage of that opportunity because we took initial steps. There's a lot of folks in state government want to see us succeed. So they're willing to give us a helping hand. And so we have taken advantage of that. So I have these two perspectives where I have traveled this coast thousands of miles, and I have seen what's happened over a period of time, decades, my lifetime really. I mean, things have changed so drastically. Orrin Pilkey, bless his heart. I've been on. I don't know. Orrin's. I guess he's still emeritus at Duke. He's retired. World famous geologist. Orrin was one of my mentors, and I'd go with him on these trips up and down the coast. And I often thought that, and he was taking his grad students, but every one of you should have been on one of those trips. I used to work for the Coastal Federation briefly towards the end of my career, and I used to give beach walks on boat banks, and we called them beach walks with an attitude. We didn't look at birds and shells, and we talked about erosion rates and climate change and rising. I'll never forget this. We were walking down the beach, and we'd meet at a certain spot, but people would join us on the walks. So a couple joined us while we were walking down the beach, and I was talking about erosion rates. Along the North Carolina coast, and Bogue Banks is fairly stable for a barrier island on the North Carolina coast. It's fairly stable, and I don't know the numbers now, but compared to something like Pea Island, the northern end of Hatteras Island, Bogue Banks is a pretty stable place. But the average erosion rate was 4 feet a year, 4 feet a year, and that's no storms. That's just so this couple had joined us, and he says, wait a minute, 4 feet a year? I said, yeah, and that's, if you get a major storm, that'd be overnight. It could be in an hour. Turns out they were from Ohio, had bought an oceanfront house on the beach, and I could see him calculating in his head what his 80-foot buffer, how long that would last. And he finally decided that he wouldn't be able to leave his house to his grandkids. And I said, well, that's probably true. And if you're okay with that, you have moved to the rim of a volcano. And if you're okay with that, if you're okay with the risk, and that you're not going to, this is not Ohio. You don't have a house on bedrock. You have it on pilings and sand. And if you understand that it's temporary, enjoy it while you can, but the chance of you leaving it to your grandkids are pretty slim. But he was just trying to wrap his mind around that. And that is one of the many things we could do if we wanted to. And that is when you buy a piece of property on a barrier island, it should be required that you get some assessment, some risk assessment of that piece of property. How many times have been hit by a hurricane? How many national flood insurance claims have been on that house? But of course, the real estate industry has fought that for decades. But that's who I am, and I'm not gonna, so when we get to questions, I'll be happy to take and answer what I can.
That's okay. I think the question for me, and I'll be first and then everybody else can join in, is that's a Bogue Banks conversation. How are things different for down in East Carteret County when it comes to these risks and these long-term looks and what the people down east should be thinking about, maybe doing? Where are our greatest risks, Rick? You're the man with the maps.
Well, down east, biggest problem is how close to sea level it is. I mean, it's there's just no the most consistent remedy for flooding is elevation, and so if you don't have it naturally, then you have to engineer it, and so. Erosion takes away your elevation, but down east doesn't even have to wait for it to be eroded. You just don't have it to start with unless you live in a very small number of areas that are just have a natural, a little bit more natural height to them. So I think that then means that from a long-term perspective, and I think the issue of grandchildren, it's not all of this needs to be taken in the context of time, and so depending on what your time horizon is, you either have to be figuring out how to get yourself up in your location, or you need to be looking for other places that are good to live that have natural elevation associated with them. If you want to stay where you are, then you need to be thinking about how to get roads and infrastructure and all of that elevated so that if you build yourself up into the air, you got to be able to get to where you are and get away from where you are. So there needs to be infrastructure to support that life. The thing that's really hard, honestly, is to say you're okay for the next 3 years, or the next 5 years, or the next 8 years, or one generation. But when is that? When do you cross that threshold? Predicting that is really hard. And but it's out there somewhere, and it depends on what your time horizon is, how what you need to do. So I don't know if that answered your question, but
yeah. So I think that's an interesting answer, and it's right. And then you got to also, I think, factor into that what you want your life to be like, and how your own health or the health of your loved ones and your family that live with you is going to potentially change. I worry a lot about how people are going to navigate decisions about whether to stay put or to evacuate during hurricanes. If you elevate your home, getting up and down into it, and things like that. So I think there's sort of this layer of just the relationship between being higher is safer in terms of flooding, and then also how you manage your day-to-day life and your health if the risks are changing in certain ways. And I think it's a doable thing. When we talk to people in Ocracoke, there's a lot of concern about whether they'll be able to get to the doctor when they need to, just because of ferries and Highway 12 and things like that. And so they have kind of another set of concerns that are very logistical around that. But I think both the structural side of things and also the physical health side of things come into play in terms of thinking about the long-term future.
Others?
Let me get something if I can.
I can hold that for you.
No, that's unless you want to, I'll just stick it in my pocket. I think the common misconception is that this is mostly a beach issue. This is an issue for people who live in places like Emerald Isle or Atlantic Beach or Sunset Beach or someplace. No, it's not. About 6 or 7 years ago, the Union of Concerned Scientists did a study by zip code. What they called nuisance flooding. When your house floods 6 times a year, every other month, nuisance flooding. You won't be able to sell your house. It comes to that point, your house is worthless. But then they looked at where that would occur by zip code. The most threatened places, immediately threatened places in North Carolina, are not on the beaches. They're places like Stumpy Point in Dare County, Hoboken, large portions of New Bern, down east. The zip codes in down east will be one of the first hit. It's low. There's no elevation. At least on the beaches, you have some elevation. But in places like Stumpy Point, you go there now, and there are houses in the water. There are ghost forests, trees that are dying because of salt concentrations. So the first places that will really feel the blow of this are not the beach towns. Now, the exception, of course, is northern Hatteras Island and NC-12. That's, if you really want to see the future, if you all haven't been out there and really want to see the future of the North Carolina coast, take a drive. Take a drive to Hatteras Inlet and see the sandbags that line the wall, the bulldozers that DOT keeps there just to push sand off the road with the next high tide. It was closed last week because of that little storm, that blow that we had. That's the future. But the immediate future, go to a place like Stumpy Point, which is drowning right now. So You know, in my community, and what the Union Concerned Scientists did, they timed it by decade. So 2030 was their first benchmark. Swansboro, we'd lose 17% of our housing stock. Now, that's a blow. You know, all small towns in North Carolina get 80% of their money from property taxes. If we lose 17% of our housing stock, that's a blow to Swansboro's budget that we would somehow have to make up or start cutting services. And so those are the kinds of issues we're facing. And the only point I'm trying to make is it's not going to be an immediate beach issue. This is going to be an issue for all those low-lying places behind all those big rivers and sounds that we have along the North Carolina coast.
How does the fact that our beach faces south enter into the computer model?
Well, we take the orientation of all of the beaches along the entire state, as well as the whole east and Gulf Coast, into exact consideration. So a storm that comes at us from the south is going to push water right at that beach. If it was an east-facing beach, it would be a little bit different. Our coastline is curved, so it's kind of like catcher's mitts. And so when the water comes, it catches in those curves. And so the fact that ours is south-facing means that when a storm comes at us, it's going to push water, and it gets caught basically for us, between Cape Lookout and Cape Fear, and gets caught in there. And so it will influence certainly the response, and we take it into account. So did I answer your question?
No, but
Well, it depends on the storm and the direction as to whether it will be worse or less worse.
Yeah.
You know, when Florence came at us, it actually came straight from the east, and so our south-facing beach fared a little bit better in that storm than, for example, when Dorian or Isaias came at us, which came at us from the south to the north. And so that actually would have pushed water more directly into our south-facing beach. So, it really, it's the orientation of the coastline compared to the orientation of the storm event itself that together make a difference.
and historically, the south-facing beaches have been a little bit safer.
Well, they're protected from nor'easters, for example, better, but I wouldn't say that they're better protected from hurricanes, particularly in our area where the hurricanes typically come from the south. Yeah. So they may not erode as sort of incrementally, because, you know, we usually get half a dozen nor'easters each year or something, some number. But when we get a hurricane, they may get hit much harder.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Would you comment on how the protection of areas that looks like Congress has now said don't have to be protected, wetlands, how if that stuff is relaxed, how is it gonna, is it not gonna affect those inland areas, and how that's gonna affect us here?
Wetlands are really valuable for a bunch of different reasons. They filter a lot of the runoff water that comes off of the land, and so when it finds its way into the coastal waters, it's much cleaner than it would be otherwise. And that's a really valuable service, and what's running off is both man-made, but it's also natural. You know, birds and animals and all of that do their business on the land, and that ends up in the water. So wetlands are really useful for a variety of reasons. We certainly know that marsh grass and things like that can do a good job of helping to protect I mean, it's not along the open coast, so it's not going to do anything for the beach of Bogue Banks, but on the along the Bogue Sound and our inner shorelines, those marshes help protect against erosion and all of the boat wakes that go by, but all of the storms that kick up waves and things. In a lot of our sounds, marshes and vegetation are very helpful to slow down erosion. They don't do an awful lot to protect you against a really big storm that just comes through and the water's up 10 feet. It goes pretty much over the top of those. So they're important parts of what makes eastern North Carolina a beautiful and productive, and they're really important for fisheries. They're important for the quality of the environment that we have here. They're not going to protect your house from getting flooded by a big storm. So I think there's a common wish that they did, but they probably, unless you've got a mile deep or something like that, they're probably not going to save your house. Yeah.
So in looking at the structures, particularly residences near the surf area, you can't help but look at Portsmouth Village. That's been there how long? 200 years or a little more?
Mm-hmm.
And some of those structures are original, I think. Do they have a technique that they use that allowed them to last so long?
Yeah, and I've been to Portsmouth twice,
Yeah.
and there's the thing that struck me, and sorry for being a bit glib, the mosquitoes must have something to do with it. They're like no others that I've ever seen. But seriously, I think they're on the sound. Portsmouth Village is clearly on the sound side, and so over the course of time, the ocean side is eroding, and will continue to erode towards it. It won't be there forever.
When you're over there, and you haven't calculated the time of high tide correctly, and you're on a four-wheeler trying to get off,
It can be wet, right?
you need to stay over there with the mosquitoes.
Exactly.
But an example, I've been going out to Core Banks since the late 70s.
Yeah.
I used to have beach trucks and I'd sleep in them and do all that stuff. Back in the late 70s, you could drive to Portsmouth Village at any tide along the beach and then through the swash. If it was a particularly high tide, you get your tires wet.
Yep.
But as you know, now you can't.
Yep.
And so there is an example of what is occurring. But the Native Americans didn't build even their temporary fishing villages on the beach. Old Nag's Head wasn't on the beach. And even when they started, Nag's Head is the first really developed island, tourist island in North Carolina. But there might be one or two of those old cottages still left, I don't know. But the old cottages were meant to be picked up and moved.
Right.
Because they knew that. They knew what they were dealing with, but then, tourism became the billion-dollar industry that it is, and we want permanent structures. So we build permanent structures on a very temporary landscape, and that's the problem. That's the problem.
Isn't the water flow around an island much different than coming straight onto a beach?
I would say yes. You'll have, so for example, if you go to Fort Macon Coast Guard Station, the currents that come in and out of Beaufort Inlet are really strong. And in fact, it's prohibited from swimming there. It's quite a hazard. So that flow of water in and out of Beaufort Inlet is much different than what you'll experience if you go down to the, the beach, the beach area, the state park, and where you'll have waves coming at you, and a little bit of alongshore drift, but but a much different type of scenario than you have. So yes, there's very different currents depending on where you are. The currents inside of Bogue Sound, for example, are much weaker than they would be coming in through Beaufort Inlet. And of course, the waves that will come at you when you're on the beach oftentimes are generated by storms that are out to sea, and the swell comes in and it breaks and you get, reasonably good waves sometimes. When you're in Bogue Sound, you don't see any of that. You just get the waves that are kind of blown up in there. So those are much smaller. So depending on where you are around the island, you'll get a very different different set of conditions that you have to deal with. Yes. Yeah.
Is there, very naive, is there a website you can go to that you can get a calculation of the erosion that could occur of your own home site?
Does Sea Grant have anything like that?
No, but I mean, what about the NOAA Sea Level Rise Viewer? That's not erosion, but that is prediction
Well,
of
just
water
to know
level.
what's gonna flood, the predictability of it flooding. I mean, you all talk about, okay, obviously real estate agents aren't gonna help you. I've seen so much false advertising on different websites and stuff. It says, my house supposedly is 20 feet, and the house that's on the creek, it says that they're not in the flood zone. Well, they're on the flood zone, I've seen it flood. So where can you go to do an accurate prediction of your site or any home?
You asked, you put in a word there at the end that changes the answer, and the word was accurate. There are various websites, and there's a lot of, myself included, well-intended people that are trying to get accurate predictions. But I don't know who it was, but predicting the future is said. I guess it was Yogi Bear or something. Predicting the future is hard, or something. I butchered that, but anyhow, again, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has websites that you can at least say, if the water level goes up a foot, how much land will it encompass? So it's kind of a map that helps just visualize what could happen. It doesn't tell you how much it's going to go up, particularly in any high tide or in any storm. There are others. There are Climate Central and First Street Foundation are doing more work in terms of, again, trying to create maps and web-based products that help communicate potential scenarios. Again, to the extent that they're accurate, the county maps that the county has flood maps, and you can look at those. They tell you something, but I think everybody that's ever looked at those maps knows at least one place where they're completely wrong. But hopefully there's maybe 80% of the places they're reasonable, and the goal is to get to 90% and then to 100%. But it's there's a lot. It's hard. It's hard.
You said that the places like Galveston and whatever had plugged into the research that you're doing. Did Norfolk, Virginia, as well, and they're doing a lot in Norfolk to raise and to block and other things.
Yeah.
Is any place in North Carolina doing anything that's similar or following that lead?
What Norfolk has that drives a lot of, Norfolk has two things, and I'm a little bit familiar with it. They have taken this seriously. They have a population. I mean, like everyone has, they have a diverse population, but they have there's been a lot of water in some fairly highly populated urban streets, and it's been recurring consistently for a decade now, and so they can't really ignore it. But what they really have is an enormous Department of Defense installation. So they've got the Navy, they've got the Coast Guard, And so there's a lot of, and Department of Defense has lots of money, and they also know that they can't just pick up their shipyard and just sort of easily go somewhere else. So there's a lot of momentum and money behind doing things there to deal with that. They absolutely do use the computer codes that we have developed to help them try to predict what's going to happen in the future, and as part of the planning process. I'm not familiar with actual engineering I know that they have been looking into a variety of different engineering options. I'm not familiar with what the various phases or what the status of that they might be in. But I know that they use that to try to understand what they're up to. Actually, I do know that some of the Navy yards, they've elevated the piers that they have that the ships pull up to, and so they've done that to at least buy themselves some more time. It's tricky when you get into these really complicated areas, because if you say, okay, I'm going to build a dam or a dike or a levee, inevitably, it may stop the water going into that location, but the water's going to go somewhere, and where it's going to go is adjacent to it. And so if you have large open areas that you can build sort of a long extent, then that's more amenable. Otherwise, you have to build miles and miles and miles of the stuff, like around New Orleans, or you're just really limited in what you can do, because you're trying to cut off a bunch of creek mouths and other things that just aren't very well suited for that kind of an engineering approach. So.
I have a question. This seems sort of minor compared to what you've been talking about, but on the south side of those banks, there's been some of that living shoreline work with the big old cement. Is that helping?
I think in general it does help, and I don't know, Frank, you probably have, and there are probably several perspectives on this. Again, help do what? Marshes and getting vegetation along your shoreline is a good thing. I mean, it's going to help in a variety of different ways to different extents. It will definitely, we see over and over that it helps protect from erosion. Again, it's not going to help when a hurricane comes through and sends a massive 10-foot storm surge. It's going to go over the top of it. So, and with sea level rise, there's a challenge of eventually it'll be underwater, and there's a lot of work being done to try to figure out how capable marshes are of self-sustaining themselves, and there's some ability to do that, but there's only a certain speed at which they can build up, and so if the water level's going up too fast, it will overtake them. And even if the water level isn't going up too fast, eventually they just sort of run out of real estate. So it's a short term to maybe medium term help, and it's a good thing to do, but it's not going to be the difference to whether your home floods.
Yeah, can I add something to that? I worked for the Coastal Federation. You all know where the Coastal Federation is, a few miles down the road on 24. It's the major coastal environmental group in North Carolina. And it was at the forefront of the whole living shoreline. We advocated it. We trained contractors. You couldn't find anybody who could build one. We trained engineers. I part with my brethren at the Coastal Federation, though, because in most instances, they contain massive granite stones. It's a rock wall. DOT just finished a massive project along our bridges in Swansboro on the White Oak side of the bridges. I don't know what this thing cost. And I've been involved in several living shoreline projects at the community college, at Hammocks Beach State Park. This is by far larger than anything I've ever seen. It cost us multi-millions of dollars. It's a series of rock walls. There are navigation. There are hazard to navigation. If the intent, the original intent of living shorelines was to provide an alternative to bulkheads. Bulkheads will absolutely destroy the shoreline. There's no scientific doubt about that. You put a wall behind your house on the sound side, you're going to destroy the beach. Anyone who's built one knows that. Within a few years, you won't have a beach at that wall. The water will come up, the high tide will come up. At low tide, you might have a beach. And that forces your neighbor to do the same thing. Because if he doesn't bulkhead his property, then, so the living shoreline was presented as an alternative so we don't have miles and miles and miles of bulkheads, which we know destroy the beach. They will, as Rick said, they are a temporary. We have a park in Swansboro. It's a historic park called Walled Shore. The Ward family donated the property to the town 100 years ago. It's been a park ever since. You get old timers. That's where they learn to swim. That's where they taught their children to swim. That's where they're teaching their grandchildren to swim. Well, it's disappearing. It is, in parts of that park are only 5 feet wide at high tide, and we would have lost it by now, I'm pretty sure. And we decided we could have bulkheaded it, and someone asked what you can do locally, and here's what you can do locally. If you elect the right people to your town board, you can do things. Town board decided we weren't going to bulkhead it. It's too expensive. The maintenance is, in a small town, you're always looking at long-term maintenance. The maintenance was enormous, and we wouldn't have a beach. So we went with a living shoreline project that the Coastal Federation designed and built for us, and it's now a very nice marsh. Now, you can't swim there, and that's what I would tell people. The days of you going down to a sandy beach and taking your kids swimming are over. We can't recreate that. There's no way we can recreate that because we'd have to do it every year, and you don't want to pay for it. So, but we will be able to protect. There's a nice little grassed area with picnic, and people go there all the time, eat lunch, and look. It's a nice southern view of the water. It's a nice place to sit, but it's no longer a place. It's not a beach anymore. But even that, we bought Ward Shore maybe a decade. The road that leads to it, I had encouraged the town to just take it out. It was a local road. It wasn't used much. Turn it into a path. Turn it into a real park, because you're only going to be spending money to try to protect that road needlessly. But they decided not to do that. But I suspect in 5 years they're going to figure out they can't keep paving it. So, so there are things local communities can do. Someone brought up the wetland issue. Understand that Supreme Court ruling just dealt with wetlands that the Army Corps of Engineers has jurisdiction under the Clean Water Act. It has, we in our land use plan in Swansboro, our policy is to protect wetlands. And what we have done is work out agreements. If a developer comes to us, wants to put up 15 houses, and he's got 6 acres of wetlands. Now, if those 16 houses don't have some kind of playground for the children, he has to pay a recreation fee to the town of Swansboro. And it's by house, and it could be many thousands of dollars. Or he has to put up a sidewalk along his. Now, we'll forgive that if you give us the wetlands. Just give us the wetlands, which you can't build on. Well, you could, but it would be very expensive, and you're going to have flooding problems. So just give us the wetlands, and we won't charge you the recreation fee. And developers have done that. So now the town owns dozens of acres of wetlands. They're not connected. There are no paths to them. We don't care. But we understand that the wetlands protect those communities from flooding and storm damage, so just leave them alone. So there are things you can do regardless of what the Supreme Court does or what the legislature does or what Congress does, but you have to elect the right people to do that. So the responsibility is ultimately yours.
Am I the only one asking questions? You brought up a subject as well of dealing with runoff.
Yes.
For instance, we were allowed to build tennis courts in a development because of the way we have our subsurface irrigation. And I'm not sure that it doesn't actually filter water and it comes out cleaner than when it went in. But rather than build hard courts, we were allowed to build the cow-cap courts because of the runoff.
Because it absorbs water? Yeah, yeah. It's not considered impervious surface. Right. You know, the states, the stormwater the coastal stormwater regulations are the strictest in the state. Particularly if you're within a half a mile of shellfish waters. There's some pretty tough regulations. But, you know, God bless them, developers always find a way to get around them. But we have become, even in the last 10 years, we've become very serious about stormwater control. We have several projects in Swansboro that deal just with, we have streets flooding. Now with, you know, a 2-inch rain. And so we had to do something, and we have, you know, there are all kinds of innovative things you can do. But once again, you know, we're a small town with a small budget, so we rely on others with deeper pockets to help us. And that takes creativity, and most small towns don't have the experience, the know-how, know people, and so it's a real hurdle. But there are lots of things local governments can do to protect local communities. But you know, it takes the will of everyone in the community.
Can I offer a counterpoint to that?
Yeah.
I think what you said, though, so Swansboro has done some really great things, and you guys, like you said, it's not that you even have all the money, but y'all have expertise in your town that allows you to go out and find that stuff. So I work with a lot of communities in North Carolina that do not have that expertise, and that is, Swansboro is by far a leader in coastal North Carolina, and you still have many, many challenges, but compared to what resources other small rural coastal communities or even more inland communities, they're so far behind Swansboro, it's not even funny. So, and that's not to say we shouldn't be helping the Swansboros, we should, but the state is starting to try to find ways and strategies to help the more underserved communities as well, because we have Swansboro and, you know, the town of Pine Hill Shores, even Beaufort has a lot of resources at, you know, that they can go to, but many small communities in North Carolina don't even have somebody on staff that knows how to plan for climate change. And they have to depend on, that right now they just don't do anything basically. So we have to find a way in our state to do better and to help those communities. And, you know, we're starting that process, but we need to reach those smaller communities now. So yes, and we can look to leaders like Swansboro to say, hey, this is really great, they've done this here, we need to learn from that. But I do want to make sure that we all know there's lots of communities that don't have that expertise that can do that kind of stuff and find that money on their own. So, not to be the negative Nancy, but. Karen, are we still taking questions?
Yes, I don't know what time it is.
It's 3:05.
3:05. More, last call for questions. Comments? Yeah.
What has the average sea level rise been over, say, the last 5 or 10 years, say, below bank? Just 2 inches or 2 feet or? I'm serious, I mean.
Yeah, so a lot goes into sea level rise because it's all relative to when you're standing on the land, right? And what we know is that the northeastern part of the state is actually sinking a little bit. So sea level could be perfectly stationary, but if you're up in the northeast part, it looks like it's rising because you're sinking. Wilmington area hasn't, and the southeastern part has sinks more slowly, or has been relatively neutral, and so that changes things. And in fact, if we're here in 2010 or thereabouts, there was an attempt to identify a sea level rise rate that could be used for planning in coastal counties, and there was a big pushback because they picked a single number, and for, you know, probably better than nothing, but nevertheless, it was not the same everywhere. That being said, I mean, I think that on average, if you look back 50 years or so, sea level rise has been something between around 1.5 millimeters a year, 1.5 millimeters a year. So there's 2.5 centimeters in an inch. So a millimeter is 1/10 of that. So it's not terribly fast. But the models have been predicting this, and we're starting to see that it's going up. And so I think that the latest estimates are up around 3 to 4 millimeters a year. And so that becomes, a centimeter every couple of years and an inch every 5 years or something. But it's not, and one of the outcomes of some of the interactions back in about 10 years ago was an insistence of only looking backwards and assuming that it was always going to stay the same going forwards. And we just simply are starting, the models tell us that's not true, it's going to accelerate, and the data now is showing us that it's starting to accelerate. So I think that it's, like I said, probably in the order of an inch every 5 years now, maybe even a little bit less than that, but it's accelerating. And as you look out into the end of this century, it's somewhere between probably 1.5 foot to 3 feet, possibly even more. And it depends, because what goes into sea level rise is changing also. So it's sinking. It's when water warms up, it expands. So up until now, that's been a lot of what's driven sea level rise. But more and more, the glaciers, both in Antarctica and Greenland, are melting. And so we're now adding more water into the pot, and that's one of the reasons why it's accelerating over the course of time. And our ability to predict that is still a little bit iffy. Again, we're getting better at it, but there's a lot of, if you go into the technical literature, you'll see there's a range. Again, sort of maybe 1.5 to 3 feet kind of range, and it's because of that uncertainty. They're trying to tell you, we don't know exactly, but it could be in that range. But those are the numbers that I think we ought to be looking at, planning for.
Can I make one last closing?
Sure.
Because I think this
The altar call.
I said I wasn't a scientist, and I'm not, but I do have an undergraduate degree in geology, and I sat at Fort Pilkey's meeting for decades, and I slept at the Holiday Inn, so that I guess counts all for something. But I think one of the issues we struggle with is timescales. Human timescale versus the geologic timescale. A couple of millimeters, a centimeter, who cares? Well, you compound that, this will be going on for hundreds of years. And so our human time scale of whatever, 80, 90 years, it's nothing. So, a few millimeters or centimeters means nothing. Compounded over several hundred years, it means quite a bit. And we've got now roads and houses and all kinds of stuff in the way. One last field trip. Take the ferry across the Moose River at Minnesota Beach. Go on over to Pamlico County. Get on the road and drive across Pamlico County. That's State Road 306. That road was built on the Suffolk Scarp. Very famous geologic formation used to extend all the way to Morehead City. Back many millennia ago, the barrier islands were out here. What you're seeing, Morehead City is a remnant of a barrier island. Beaufort's on a remnant of a barrier island. What you now see on both sides used to be that. Those are the remnants. And the Suffolk Scarp, you go up the Suffolk Scarp, stop the car anywhere, stop the fire stations, or take a road to the right. You don't have to go very far, and you'll see it's all farmland. And you'll see the elevation just. The Suffolk Scarp was where the Atlantic Ocean was the last time we had no ice on the globe. It's happened before. No reason to think it won't happen again. So, if those glaciers disappear, as they're heading for, that's where the ocean will be again. Now, you take a look at a map, Pamlico County, the Albemarle-Pamlico Sound is gone. Counties, Carteret County is gone. Hyde County, Carroll County are all gone. The Outer Banks will be islands, wherever you have some high points. The Bank's Head is one. You'll have these pearls, this little pearl necklace stretching off the coast. 100 years, maybe 200 years, certainly. But again, we have a hard time with those kinds of timescales. But it's happening. And physics does not care. Ice will melt at 32 degrees. Whoever the president of the United States is, whoever's heading the UN or anything else, ice will melt at 32 degrees. And so it's coming. I'm certain of it. I won't see it. My granddaughter will, and when she's old enough, she's only 4. When she's old enough, I plan to apologize for not doing more than I should.